with the Ash Center, and I'm asked to ask that you follow events on Twitter at Harvard Ash, and you can tweet comments about this event at #AshTalk. My name is Lessig. I'm the director of the Edmund J. Safra Center. We don't have as cool a little hashtag, so don't worry about that. And I'm very happy to welcome Congressman Sarbanes for a conversation about the current state of our politics, inspired by the bill that he has just recently introduced called the Grassroots Democracy Act. So our plan is this: I'm the moderator, and I will try to be moderate, not often moderate, but we will ask Congressman Sarbanes to speak, to introduce for everybody in the audience the ideas behind the act, and then we're going to ask Archon Fung, who is from the Kennedy School, and Spencer Overton, who is a professor of law at George Washington Law School, and Steve Ansolabehere, who's a professor in the government department here. So then we'll have a conversation. We'll invite people to participate in the conversation. If you want to participate, then what you should do is you should get my eye, and I will acknowledge that you've gotten my eye, and then I will keep a cue that allows the conversation to flow in a relatively ordered way. So with that, Congressman Sarbanes.
Thanks very much, Professor Lessig. I appreciate the invitation to be here. I'm looking forward to this discussion because we've got some terrific people on the panel that you're going to hear from today. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk about the Grassroots Democracy Act, and I'm going to do that in 3 minutes as I was instructed. The premise for this bill that was introduced is that there's too much money in our politics right now that's having an undue influence, not just on the way campaigns are waged and the results of those campaigns, but also on the way public policy is made in Washington. And Professor Lessig has written about this idea of the institution of Congress becoming overly dependent on big money, special interests, and the effect that has when it comes time for us to try to make good public policy. I see that from the inside. I think it is a real problem, and I think we need to find a way to create a different dependency, one that's based on the people, where you turn in the direction of the people, where the institution tilts towards the people. The other premise for this is the great cynicism being felt, I think, by most Americans when they look and they feel that their voice can't be heard anymore, because how can they compete with the Sheldon Adelsons and Foster Frieses of the world, or even the traditional industry PACs that are so heavily invested in the Washington scene. So our goal with the Grassroots Democracy Act was really to try to empower the grassroots, give them a voice, be able to compete with the influence of these other sources of campaign cash. And so there's three very straightforward elements to this. The first is to broaden grassroots participation in the funding of campaigns by creating a refundable tax credit of up to $50 in an election cycle, $25 in each of the 2 years of the cycle. So if you decide you want to contribute to Congressman Sarbanes' campaign, $25, then $25 of the taxes you pay comes back to you in the form of a refundable tax credit that can underwrite that campaign contribution. That really eliminates the bar to entry for all Americans who want to participate in this, and we think will broadly increase grassroots participation. So that's component number one. But we need to do more in order to amplify the voice of the grassroots. So that what we say is that if the donation you make is to a candidate that is a truly grassroots candidate, and the requirements that we put in place for that is that candidate has to agree to forego all PAC donations. The candidate has to go out and recruit 2,000 grassroots donors. Those are people who give $100 or less. And the candidate has to raise $50,000 from the grassroots. If the candidate you support with your $25 contribution meets those requirements and is a truly grassroots candidate, then the contribution you made gets multiplied 5 to 1 or 10 to 1 from a public fund that is established. It's 5 to 1 if the candidate you support decides they still want to take some higher donations in the mix. It's 10 to 1 if the candidate you support says, I will take no donations of more than $100. So that's taking the grassroots contribution you made, multiplying it 5 or 10 times, and allowing the grassroots to begin to compete with these other sources. And the last piece is we don't want to have a situation where the grassroots donor is suddenly beginning to feel not so cynical about the world because they see that their voice can be heard. They've made the contribution, they're supporting a grassroots candidate, they're getting the multiple match. But next thing they know, the candidate they support is in a race where super PACs and other outside groups are pouring a ton of money in. And suddenly the voice that they helped their candidate bring into the discussion is getting marginalized again. So we created the People's Fund, which is an opportunity where in a race where there's a grassroots candidate, there's a lot of noise coming from outside groups, and it reaches a certain threshold. That candidate can go to the People's Fund, think of it as America's Super PAC, and get some additional dollars correlated to the amount of grassroots support they've already demonstrated in order to get back into the speech game. There's constitutional terrain that has to be navigated with this. We think we've done a pretty good job of anticipating that. And that's it. That's the Grassroots Democracy Act. Tax credit, there's also a component there which Professor Lessig has written about, is very interested in if we could put that in the form of a voucher or coupon where it's sort of immediately redeemable. We can talk more about that. So you got the tax credit, you got the multiple match, and then you got the People's Fund to help keep your candidate in the game once you support them. Thank you.
Fantastic.
That's great. Thank you very much, Congressman. So in this topic, I'm reminded of a quote from an early 20th century Midwestern political kingmaker named Mark Hanna. And he said, "In all my time in politics, I've learned that there are only three important things. There's money and I forget what the second two are." And so this is a fantastic effort to try to change that long-standing, difficult, and increasingly painful reality, especially of American politics. And there's at least three different facets or areas in which you could discuss the Grassroots Democracy Act. There's the question of the policy design itself, questions of institutional design. And I don't really have much to say about that because I really, really like the institutional design. I think it's a very, very clever and powerful way to not try to get money out of politics, but use money, shape the distribution of money in a way that increases grassroots popular participation. And so I think that's a fantastic institutional design. So I basically have no comments on that. The other two areas to think about are, one, the question of transition and how to get from here to there. And that is a political question. And I'll say just a little bit about that. And then I'll say a little bit about another dimension, which is what happens if we actually get it. Maybe we should be careful what we wish for. And that's it. So mostly my remarks are on the transition, how to get from here to there. And I want to offer people four different kinds of strategies and think about, well, which one should we pursue? Two inside strategies, that is inside the Beltway strategies, and two outside strategies, that is more society-based strategies. The one inside strategy, which is kind of what both parties try to do on a lot of policy issues, is the domination of a faction. Try to amass enough troops, probably from your side of the aisle, that are for this particular reform measure and get enough votes and basically overrule the other guy, the inside domination strategy. That doesn't seem so promising to me because, well, for a bunch of reasons. The second kind of strategy is coalition of self-interested reformers. And here the idea is that the money in politics game has been so painful in different ways to so many that a system that worked for people in the past now they feel like is no longer working for them, and so maybe it's a moment of reform. So this happens once in a while. You could think that if, there were a number of splits, say the last three elections had split electoral versus popular, going different ways for the different parties, and sometimes the Democrats benefit and sometimes the Republicans benefit. They might say, well, this is a system that's too crazy and we want to reform it because we both lose by it, right? And maybe, and this came out a little bit yesterday in the discussion, maybe for enough people on both sides of the aisle, the pain of having to raise money for so much of the percentage of a legislator's time has reached that threshold where there is a kind of coalition of factions that would all be benefit from a different kind of money in politics regime than the one we have now. That's possible. I want to talk about two outside strategies, though. One is the social movement strategy, and the thought here is that you can't really get it done without a lot of outside pressure from not just from the fair election groups like Common Cause and so on that have been working on this for a while, but that the issue of money in politics and the grassroots democracy proposal needs to have much more popular traction through your own efforts and through the efforts of those groups to then put pressure on legislators to make the piece of legislation go forward. And I think that's probably true even for the president's priorities. I think we see forward movement in reform directions on issues like Don't Ask, Don't Tell or immigration reform, largely from the pressure of outside groups. So they help make that an important priority. Fourth kind of outside strategy is interesting and a little bit stranger, so I'll spend a couple minutes on that. And the idea of this outside strategy is that, to paraphrase Clausewitz, that political reform is an issue that's too important to be left to politicians, because what politicians often do is make political rules of the game that benefit their own interests. So here the idea is to create bodies that have something to say about political reform that aren't composed of politicians but of ordinary citizens. And so Larry has written a little bit about proposals like this. One interesting one comes from British Columbia, Canada, where the province was trying to decide whether to move from first past the post system of majority rule for its provincial legislature to some sort of proportional representation. And the premier of the province said, we don't want this to go through the assembly, the provincial assembly, because they'll just make rules that entrench themselves. And so what we're going to do instead is impanel a huge jury, randomly selected, more or less 170 people from around the province, and they're going to meet every other weekend for a year and talk about different voting rules. And we think that they'll make a better choice because they don't have the political interest in the status quo system. They'll make a choice that better reflects the values of the electorate, whether it's representation or competitiveness or whatever it is, right? And so that's what they did. They came up with a proposal called the single transferable vote, and what they came up with skipped the legislature and went straight to a popular referendum that garnered about, I think, 57% of the popular vote, but it failed because the threshold was 60%. So it's a little bit of a bittersweet story. So anyway, one thing to think about is what combination of inside strategies and outside strategies is most promising for the Grassroots Democracy Act. That's the transition question. For the unintended consequences question, Dan Winkler brought this up in the discussion following your talk yesterday about, well, suppose you get the Grassroots Democracy Act. What are the ways in which it could be co-opted to deliver political results that are not those and send into motion political dynamics that are not those that you rightly wish for? And so here the possibility is that you get grassroots donation industry that fires up, just like in states with, especially California, with where initiative and referendum proposals play a big part in state politics. You get machines, often for-profit, that will deliver the requisite number of signatures and charge you X number of cents or dollars per signature. Couldn't you also get that for the Grassroots Democracy Act? And I think you have some answers to that have to do with overhead and stuff, but I think it's worth thinking a little bit more about that question, because oftentimes these kinds of proposals get co-opted by the force of money a little bit more quickly than we think. But, these are interesting, I think, things to think about, and I hope that I give people a little bit of food for thought in these remarks. But from a larger vantage, the reflections and criticisms here are very minor, very, very minor, compared to the promise and the ambition of the Grassroots Democracy Act. In thinking about the role of academic critics like us for big ideas and big proposals like this one, I'm reminded of a scene from a cartoon, actually, from Pixar's Ratatouille, in which the bad guy, Anton Ego, the mean food critic, engages in a moment of self-reflection. And he says that In many ways, the work of a critic is easy. We risk very little, yet enjoy a position over those who offer up their work and their selves to our judgment. We thrive on negative criticism, which is fun to write and read. But the bitter truth is that we critics must face is that in the grand scheme of things, the average piece of junk is probably more meaningful than our criticism designating it so. But there are times when a critic truly risks something, and that is in the discovery and the defense of the new. The world is often unkind to new talent and new creation. The new needs friends. So thanks for exposing yourself to our
This is an
criticism.
above average piece of junk.
That's great, Archon. Thank you. Spencer Overton is new to the community. Let me just make sure you have a sense a little bit about his background. Spencer has been a strong, tireless advocate for thinking about this kind of reform. He was with the Obama administration for a period. He left and now is an academic. But his academic work has been focused on how to refocus the energy of politics, in particular recognizing the important participatory interest of people in being able to contribute and have a voice in the contributions that guide an election. So when the Congressman was willing to come, I thought it was extremely important to bring him up to have him comment on this and to add his voice. So Spencer, welcome.
Thank you so much, Larry, and thanks also just for like these gatherings in terms of exchanging substantive ideas. I mean, part of it is this, but part of it is also afterward and our interaction and building relationships. So thanks for building this intellectual community here. Jennifer Campbell, thanks for going above and beyond in terms of making this a great event, and certainly my trip up here great. Congressman Sarbanes, I'll tell you, I really appreciate having a member who is committed to reform, wanting to do something to improve democracy. You know, this is directly in line with the goal of increasing the number of small donors, as you all know. Now, why is this new? This is new because traditional reform efforts have focused on kind of choking money out. How can we create some restriction or regulation to ensure that we tap money down, that we close all loopholes, and loopholes inevitably open up. Right now, the press is on for more extensive disclosure, some kind of politically vulnerable targets like restricting spending by oil companies or foreign corporations, that kind of thing. But in terms of addressing the big problem, right? And I think that a big problem here is participation or lack thereof it. Relatively few Americans make political contributions. About 64% of eligible Americans in 2008 voted in that election, and yet politicians receive the bulk of their money from less than 0.5% of the population, right? And so just as civic norms encourage all citizens to vote, I'm heartened by this notion of let's move toward more people participating in giving a contribution to a candidate of his or her choice. I'm a law professor, I'm not a political scientist, but the political science literature suggests that people who give a political contribution are more likely to volunteer, they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to be engaged. So this is a good as opposed to an evil. This income piece is key. We see that families with incomes of people who are from families with incomes of $100,000 or more, right, make up about 11% of the population, cast 14.9% of the votes, but are responsible for nearly 80% of the itemized political contributions here. And the reason that is that candidates face lower transaction costs in mobilizing larger contributions from a narrow group, right? In other words, a politician might say, hey, why should I call 10 people and ask for $100 each when I can call one person and ask for $1,000, right? It just makes sense. And the political science also shows us that people are most likely to give if they are asked. So they have to be asked. We have to give some incentive to politicians to reach out to average folks to get them to engage. And these reforms, they work, right? You look at a place like California that doesn't have any incentives for folks to give. And there, candidates collect less than 5% of their money from people who give $250 or less. But you look at places that have incentives, like New York City, or like Minnesota used to have a pretty good incentive. And over half of the money that candidates receive come from people who give $250 or less. I'm also appreciative of the fact that there's a pragmatism here. Now, I'll have to just be honest. I heard Congressman Sarbanes on the radio one day, and I said to myself, man, this is complex. Simplicity is really important. We've got a lot of things going on here, and critics of reform cherry pick one little provision, and they knock on it, and they knock the whole thing down, just to doom the whole effort, right? But you know, I had the opportunity to talk to him and hear his presentation last night and today. And I really get this notion of pulling together various proposals that have been out there that people have talked about, put them into one bill, let them live or die based on a conversation, and having a conversation about all of these proposals, whether it's vouchers or tax credits or matching small contributions, that are designed to enhance political participation here. I love this notion of allowing candidates to receive both traditional dollars and smaller dollars with the 5-to-1 match. You know, there's some programs that say, well, you either have to choose our program or just go and be corrupt, right? And I don't know that we want that. I'd much rather have a candidate who receives half of his or her money from a large number of small donors as opposed to just 1% because they had this either or choice. So that's something that's great. I will, Archon, I hear you in terms of the entrenchment piece, right? That, you know, hey, will politics do something? Politicians do enact a reform that works against them, right? And what I would say is the old public financing models were much less friendly to incumbent politicians because what they asked incumbent politicians to do is, hey, give your opponent as much money as you have, right, out of the public till and have a fair fight here, right? That's what we're asking. Now what we're saying is, hey, politician, you're splitting your time between Washington, D.C. and home, and you're trying to satisfy these multiple constituencies? No, you don't have to do that. You can raise your money at home. You're going home every weekend. You can go home, you can have some house parties, and you can raise some real money. So I think that, you know, there's some things that incumbents would really like about this, certainly much more so than traditional public financing, in part because it takes into account the realities of politicians as opposed to just completely vilifying them. So now, in terms of just observations, when we talk about how, you know, what nits might you have, you know, you definitely want to properly structure this tax credit, right? It's great that it's refundable so that poor folks and lower income folks who don't have tax liability can take advantage of it. You remember we had a tax credit before 1986, and one problem there is that it was non-refundable and there was low participation, right? Another big thing that's not necessarily, I don't know that it's spelled out, or at least I didn't see it, is avoiding administrative barriers is key. Having easy refund application process. You know, the Minnesota program was successful because people got money back within a couple of weeks. And it was really easy and quick, and that sparked participation. Also, Ohio has had a tax credit, and they had lower participation because you had to fill out the long form of the tax form to get it, and so a lot of people didn't apply for it or use it. One other thing, and this might not be politically popular, but I might consider expanding the tax credit to political parties because the objective here is to give people incentives to participate and also political actors incentives to encourage folks to participate. I do think that there might be some constitutional questions with this court, and it's not that I agree with the court, it's just the way this court looks at these questions, There may be some constitutional questions with the People's Fund trigger. Also, to the extent you can match contributions, the first 100 of a contribution is one way to do it. As I understand it, and tell me if I'm wrong, you can also match contributions of $100 or less, right? And the court could say that there's an Arizona free enterprise problem if you do that, because you may discourage people from giving more than the $100. Now, I'm not saying it's logical. I'm just saying that that might be the way some of them might look at it. I think another issue here is that politicians often repeal things that aren't budget neutral. In other words, somebody comes along and says, oh, we got to balance our budget, and therefore we don't want to raise taxes. Let's cut these tax credits. Let's cut this spending, etc. And that, happens every 5 or 6 years, right? And so I'm not saying we shouldn't move for public financing. I'm saying that if we're going to lay a variety of proposals on the table, we may also want to lay out some budget neutral proposals. One might be small donor PACs. We talked a little bit about that. They have them in Colorado, and what they do is it can collect only up to $50 from a person, a natural person. But the small donor PAC can give 10 times as much as a normal PAC to the candidate, right? So that's one reform that's budget neutral. Another thing you could do is, right now, parties can't spend in coordination with races, or they can do it only up to a certain amount. They're limited. What you could do is you could say, here's a small donor pot for a party. Any money in there you can pour into any candidate race you want to, and you can coordinate with them, or you could give it to your party's candidate or whatever. Again, giving parties incentives to mobilize smaller donors here. I'm going to wrap this up here, but I just say that how we talk about public financing is incredibly important, and defending it, not being embarrassed or ashamed and saying that this is unworthy. We spend money on things, and this is important. We spend money on ballots, on voter registration, on other tools for democratic participation. This really is no different, and it returns, there's a return on investment in terms of a government that spends just trillions of dollars a year. There's a huge return on investments. It's a very small percentage of the budget. It's like the investment in a lock on your door, right, compared to the cost of your whole house. It's important to protect the house. So, Congressman, thanks so much. I really do admire you personally, because I think it's easy to get caught up in the climbing game in D.C., teaching in D.C. and stature and titles and stuff, as opposed to really doing something substantive and meaningful that can help people. And I think this is a great start.
Great, thank you. And we'll finally ask Steve, who is a very brave, let's follow the numbers sort of person, who has had his head down, focusing on the numbers, and created an industry of scholarship that has asked a hard question. Do we have an easy way, or do we have a clear way to demonstrate the particular harm that seems to motivate much of us in this work? So I was very happy that he agreed to participate in this conversation after coming back from spending almost all night with CBS trying to tell us what was going to happen in the election. So Steve, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Well, part of the night was easy, and part of it was hard. So I've been around the campaign finance world for a while. Full disclosure, I worked for the Brennan Center on the defense of BCRA. A lot of high expectations and high hopes about BCRA, and watched it be dismantled over the last decade, especially the last 6 years. I think the lessons from that dismantling ought to be very informative about current proposals, including Congressman Sarbanes' proposal. And there's a big third bullet point on outside money that I think is kind of the big thing to be aware of and wary of. I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to highlight that as a big first question. Like, how do you deal with problems that were the undoing of BCRA? Archon alluded to some of them, and I think a lot of the undoing of BCRA was actually the details of the way it was written. It was things like the Millionaires Amendment that the court found as entry points and completely undid large parts of the law as a result, and actually extended precedents in directions that we might find difficult going forward. The second big area to highlight and question I would put on the table is we've had public funding systems in the U.S. states and at the national level since the 1970s. Some of them actually have a lot of the features that you're bringing to bear, especially the matching system in the primaries, presidential funds. They've all fallen apart. And they've not fallen apart because of legal decisions or interventions or any of the other things we've talked about. They've fallen apart. They've fallen under their own weight. They've not been able to adequately fund the campaigns, and so the campaigns have abandoned them one after the other. In fact, the campaign that perhaps did the most to undo the presidential funding system was the Obama campaign. So those, I think, are the two big issues to deal with. One is the outside money, and the other is the adequacy problem. Let me say a little bit more about each one and how we might go forward in this domain. Just not everybody in the room probably follows the court as closely as some of the people up here do, but what's happened with the BCRA is there have been a series of challenges to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. The first of them was McConnell v. FEC. All of us working on McConnell v. FEC on both sides found that the court's decision was a complete shock that they upheld the law. We thought it was going to go down. Everybody on the inside thought it was going to go down. And they thought it was going to go down because it put restrictions on speech. Very simple restrictions on speech. So I didn't think it was constitutional. Other people on either side thought it was constitutional. But the court upheld it on the basis of a not mainstream case, Austin v. Michigan, within the Supreme Court decisions that the Supreme Court had issued since 1976. So there was this idea that free speech is paramount and it cannot be restricted. Independent spending, outside money cannot be restricted. You can't tell somebody they can't hear a 30-second ad on their own, with their own money, within 6 months of the campaign or 6 weeks of the campaign or the day before the campaign. You just can't do that. And yet the court upheld that on the basis of a second kind of idea, which was trying to maintain competitiveness. And a lot of our debates over time have been about that question of competitiveness, and I think that this is trying to shift our focus to a different way of thinking about the problem, which is great. Because I think going forward, we're going to need to get out of that mindset, and that's what you're trying to do, which is terrific. So we have to come up with a completely new tack on this, both as a legal matter and as a political matter. And I think that's what this law could accomplish. I would encourage you to be patient. It took a decade to pass the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. The seeds were all there, and it took them a decade. But that's, I think, just the nature of this problem. It takes a long time, and it could all be undone in a night. What happened with over the last 6 years, and Spencer knows this better than I do, is that there were various weaknesses in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, and they're reflected in some of the things that Archon mentioned. I think the most damning was the Millionaires Amendment, which was an amendment that said if a millionaire comes in and spends $350,000 of his own money to defeat you, then all these spending limits start getting changed and contribution limits start getting changed, and you can raise tons of money. Right? So triggers like that are very dangerous to put into any bill. And there's some sense that what the court found objectionable about that might be a weakness here. And in particular, what the court ruled in this case, the Millionaires case, and in some of the other cases, was that what is meant by free speech is not just a restriction on speech, but any burden that's placed on speech, including any promise that you might actually change the rules in response to some speech. That might be viewed as a burden. I think the Arizona decision is probably the most troubling in this regard. And I'd like to hear how you guys think you might be able to get around that. But I think that's a very big problem. So the second problem is the adequacy problem. And I think this is, from the social science perspective, a bit of a mystery. Like, why did it collapse? Why did the public funding systems collapse when they collapsed? And they did collapse. And we don't know, we don't understand theoretically or even empirically what the nature of the collapse was. But they clearly have fallen apart. It looked like the pressures were twofold. One was the amount of money you could raise apart from the limits was just exceptional. And so politicians started abandoning the limits and trying to find new ways to package the money. Some of the mechanisms you guys suggested, just sort of on the fly, suggested maybe there were ways to package these tax credits. There's lots of creative thinking about tax credits in DC. So like package these tax credits and come up with some new fund that is like the super PAC fund for the tax credits. Like, could you come up with some crazy notion like that, and how do you contain that? But the adequacy problem is the underlying pressure that's unavoidable. There's a certain amount of money that's willing to come to politics. It seems to be fairly constant. It goes up with income, doesn't go up with CPI. I think the reason that the public funding collapsed was that when it was conceived of in 1974 and 1976, it was targeted to the CPI and not to income. And we know that money goes up pretty regularly with the amount of income in the society. And so what eventually happened is by 1992, the limits were no longer, the public funding was no longer adequate, and so we started to see party money coming in over the transom. Samus Ackroft has a great article on the hydraulic nature of money. It's just there's so much money that's out there, it's going to find a way around it. And the question is, when does it bother us, or what can we build up as a firewall against it? I think one of the nice things about the proposal you put forth is that your matching is on a kind of percentage basis, like 5 to 1 and so forth, as opposed to on a capita basis, like this many dollars per people or this many dollars per dollar. And that'll help you get around that. But one thing to think about is there some pressure that you see in the political system or in the campaign funding system that could kind of hydraulically go around the way you've conceived of the amount of money that is in the system and will always be in the system over time? And those would be the two big questions that I put forth to you.
Okay, so why don't we give you as much time as you need, if I'm being cruel to our guests, to respond to this, and then we'll begin to take questions or other responses from the panel.
Well, first of all, I appreciate all of this observation and discussion of this. This is what we wanted to see happen. We wanted to get a discussion going. We did design this proposal in many respects as a starting point for a discussion. Frankly, there's been a number of different proposals. There are currently 3, I'd say, active proposals in this space that have been introduced, and probably more to come. And it's, to my mind, it's less about the specific details within each one than it is about getting some concepts put forward and building momentum around it and developing inside and outside strategies for keeping that momentum going, which I think is critical. And I think the moment is right for that for a whole variety of reasons. So there's been some great questions posed here and critiques that I think are going to be very useful going forward, just for me personally, as we think about how to present this to people. On the adequacy question, you're speaking mostly, I think, to the presidential system. Are you not, when you talk about it collapsing? I mean, I guess the
the
BCRA
congressional system was taken apart at the get-go.
But one of the things we've done in our bill, and you referred to it, Spencer, is we've built this kind of bridge in terms of candidate participation where you don't have to immediately give up higher donations if you otherwise qualify as a grassroots candidate in order to get this multiple match. And then if ultimately you do give those up, you can get a 10-to-1 match, and we sunset it over time. But I think if one question is, can congressional candidates raise enough money to sustain their campaigns in the Grassroots Democracy Act, frame, that'll begin to be answered during this bridge period, because they're going to be getting dollars from the public matching fund, and that combined with their grassroots donations in a certain amount. And if they're making the judgment that that's not enough to sustain their campaign, they're going to continue to take some higher donations to kind of fill that void, whereas the sustainability would be much more in question if we were requiring, as some other proposals have, that they go straight to giving up all donations over $100, and then they might encounter that that's not working, even with the matches and other things that are in there. So there'll be this period of time in which, as candidates begin to test it and try it, which they will do because they're not leaping off of a cliff right from the get-go, where we can begin to see the adequacy potential or risk that's there. In terms of the People's Fund, we spent a lot of time in the design of that. We were very conscious of the Millionaires Amendment and the sort of constitutional terrain that had to be navigated here. And we were trying to be sensitive to the courts frowning on sort of punishing oppositional speech, and also situations where you, quote, are leveling the playing field. And our goal, to use that metaphor, to extend it, was not to level the playing field, but just keep legitimate candidates on the playing field. And what's happening now with the super PACs and other outside funders that come into these races is they create such a decibel level, so much noise, that in effect they can push the voice of the actual candidate off of the playing field altogether. So the construct of this was not to have the candidate be able to go to the People's Fund and get a one-to-one match against the spending of a super PAC or against the spending of some other candidate. So not to try to level the playing field or punish anybody's speech. It was really let them go to the People's Fund to get enough dollars or some additional dollars that they can get back into the speech game, which they've been pushed out of. And what's interesting about some of the analysis that's being done right now, just in the last few days, of what impacted the spending of super PACs have on the results of this election, where people are saying, well, there was hundreds of millions of dollars came in, they didn't change the outcome as much as they expected, and so forth, is that may suggest, not that super PACs aren't going to have influence, because they have and they will, but that there's a saturation points in all of this that mean that you don't, as a candidate, have to have as much money, an equal amount as what the super PAC is putting in. You just need to have enough to stay in the game long enough to kind of sustain your campaign. And that's really the premise behind the People's Fund opportunity that we've designed. Now, I am perfectly aware that this court can find all kinds of ways to strike down things that we think we've designed to pass muster. So I'm not naive about that, but I think we've made a pretty good faith effort to anticipate the objections, at least the ones we know of, right? And again, maybe get a discussion going that we can strengthen the design of this to be even more durable against that kind of a challenge going forward. One thing I didn't mention, which I think is important just for you to know, is the burden, and was referenced by Spencer, the burden on members of Congress right now in terms of the amount of time that we spend on fundraising. And Larry talks about this in his book. I read his book from cover to cover, by the way, which I think surprised him. But after that, it was a page turner after page 10. But he talks about 30 to 70% of the average member of Congress' time now is spent on fundraising. 30 to 70%. And I don't spend 70%, but I spend more than 30, and a lot of my colleagues are at the high end of that range. And the casualty of that is twofold. One is we're walking around in a sort of state of collective distraction because you just can't concentrate on the work that you need to do. And think about it in a moment like this, when we've got all these huge challenges with the fiscal cliff and so forth, you would need the combined 100% focus of every member of Congress to make a good run at solving those problems. And at this point in the culture of the place, we're distracted by the imperative of fundraising. So that's one casualty, is we just can't concentrate. The other is we don't have the time to spend building relationships with our colleagues. And I said last night, I can count on two hands the number of times I've had lunch with my colleagues in 6 years. Because if you have that much time in the middle of the day to eat lunch, you got enough time to go make phone calls, fundraising phone calls. And that's what everybody's doing. And the result of that is you don't get to know people, you don't build relationships of trust, and what suffers is making good public policy. Ted Kennedy, great senator from this state, and Orrin Hatch, on the other side of the political spectrum, worked together for many years to develop really good, strong legislation for the American people. They did it because they had a personal relationship they built over time. Those relationships really don't happen these days. And part of it is the amount of time that we're spending on this fundraising. So if we can deal with the lack of concentration, and if we can deal with getting back to some relationships, we may get back to making good public policy.
So let me just start with one question and then invite people to signal the questions they want to ask. But I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about the motivation here. I think I'm pretty clear of where Archon and Spencer are about the need to reform the system. But Steve, what is your ultimate view about the mix of information that you've compiled here about the nature of the problem and whether this is a problem that needs to be addressed? Are you skeptical? Are you convinced? Are we all on that agreed about the need, whether we've found a way to solve it?
So I think the fundamental problem has very little to do with interest groups corrupting members of Congress. The fundamental problem in the campaign finance system is that only in about 10% of the races in the United States House of Representatives, and a small number of Senate races every year, a small number of people in battleground states are seeing any political communication at all. And correct me if I'm wrong, but a typical member of Congress spends somewhere between $750,000 and $1 million in an uncompetitive race, and a typical challenger spends about $50,000. So what's happening in most congressional races, and I'm sure all of us in Massachusetts, except for the tyranny to say, experience this, is no political discourse, no dialogue, no grassroots, because the minority party in every district hears nothing from their standard bearer. And the problem is insufficient funding at all. So one of the things that's nice about this proposal is that it creates an incentive for people to actually fund these uncompetitive races.
Okay, so that makes it sound like the problem is...
And I don't know if it'll increase competition, it'll increase discourse, it'll increase dialogue.
Okay, so that's very appropriate for a professor to think that the problem is that people aren't getting enough information or education about the political process, and I share that view. But what's interesting is the problem that Congressman Sarbanes is focused on is the effect of this system on the members themselves and their capacity to do the job, number one. And number two, I think he has a different view about the effect of the influence on the actual ultimate outcome.
I'm not sure that this law will actually alter that dynamic inside of Congress, because what this does, it creates an incentive to raise more small money, or it creates more of an incentive to raise small money. But raising small money is extremely time consuming. If you really wanted to change the calculation of how much time is spent raising money, you'd raise the contribution limits to $100,000.
Except the difference is, even if it's, and this is a point that Congressman made last night, even if it's the same amount of time that you're spending raising money,
Right.
you're not raising money from the tiniest fraction of the 1%, you're raising money from everybody.
But that says it's not the amount of time that he's
That's right.
spending. It just says it's who he's getting the money from. So that shifts it back to this question about whether the money is corrupting, and then there's the big debate among the academics that it's kind of ambiguous on that. So So if it's a time issue, which is what I heard you as saying the ultimate issue is, then I'm not sure this solves the time issue. And I think there are other things that need to be done inside Congress, like putting the Democratic staff and the Republican staff back in the same building. I think Nancy Pelosi pulled a bunch of Republican staff out of the House and physically separated them. I think those staff need to interact more. There are other things that need to be happening inside Congress that are not in the campaign finance system that have to do with the operations of Congress that would probably improve some of these interactions and relations.
Well, let me talk a little bit about the time, because I think that, well, first of all, to pick up what Larry said for a minute, even if it was the same amount of time, it would be time, I think, better spent, because it would be focused in a different direction. What you discover, and I think maybe Spencer touched on this, is that if you're turning to the grassroots for funding, you're now turning in the direction where all the other grassroots stuff happens that you want to see happen. It's where volunteers are. It's where people make calls and knock on doors. It's the conversation members of Congress ought to be having with their time. So even if it's still, 30 to 70%, it's a conversation that's going on with the people rather than a conversation going on from cubicles at the D-Trip or the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, cold calling funders. But I do actually believe that as you turn to the grassroots, particularly using some of the new communication and outreach tools that the internet provides and so forth, that you can develop systems of communicating on an ongoing basis with the grassroots and then appealing to them for financial support that actually require less of the personal time of the candidate. When you're making those fundraising calls from the D-Trip, it's got to be you. If you're asking somebody for $1,000 or $2,000, it's got to be the candidate. And oftentimes it's the candidate making the 10th call to that same person. But if you develop a system where you're in communication by email with a large group of networked grassroots supporters, you're keeping them up to date on what you're doing in Washington, and then periodically you're saying, I need your support financially to help, in effect, protect your franchise. That's a system of communicating and of making appeals for financial support that can be done without the same level of committed personal time of the candidate. So the candidate can get back to doing the job that those grassroots folks want them to do, which is study the material, get to know your colleagues, build relationships, and go pass and debate good public policy. So I don't think I'm wrong about that projection. Again, unintended consequences can occur, but even if I accept the proposition that it won't be less time, I think it'll be time better used. And I do believe that in terms of the personal commitment of time for the candidates, you could see an improvement there.
Just to build on that, I think we have this assumption that in presidential campaigns, people can raise for a candidate, but in congressional campaigns, the congressperson has to make the ask, and maybe that's because of call time. But I would say that, especially to the extent that you have matching funds, there's notion that you have a relationship with some grassroots activists who are mobilizers, who encourage other folks to give or come to a house party or that kind of thing, and maintaining a relationship with that core group, just as you might can maintain a relationship with some volunteers. I mean, if we expect volunteers to go out and help mobilize voters or do some other stuff, work some polling locations, I think that it's reasonable to say those people might be able to reach out and mobilize and ask folks for a contribution. And I agree that technology can lower transaction costs in terms of reaching potential contributors, but I also think there's an opportunity for in-person retail personalized asks, even if it's not from the candidate, but it's from someone else in that orbit who's a part of the cause.
Look at it this way. I'm going to do in a strong campaign. I'm going to do 50 house parties, regardless of all the other time I've spent. Okay, 50 house parties. So if at each house party you get 50 people, and they each make a $20 contribution, taking advantage of a refundable tax credit, that's $1,000 right there. So that's $50,000 raised at your 50 house parties. Now put a 5-to-1 match on that because the candidate you're supporting is a grassroots candidate. That's $250,000. At a 10-to-1 match, that's $500,000. Now, to raise $250,000 through call time or $500,000 is a lot of time. But you've just solved that problem if you've got the Grassroots Democracy Act in place with 50 house parties, which are things you were going to want to do anyway because that's how you communicate and reach out to the people in your district. So it's the combination of what the tax credit, which is beginning to increase the numbers of participants, plus the multiple match can do that starts to get you to real money again and relieves you of the need to go out and do this other.
So let me suggest a simplification then, which is to get rid of the tax credit and just go with matching. Have a match.
Well,
because it's not clear to me that the tax credit's actually going to get you many more new donors, because most people don't actually itemize their taxes below a certain income level. And so they're not going to go out, the deduction's not going to affect large parts of the wage earners in the United States. So the tax deduction is going to affect the upper income folks, but not most of them, a lot of them are already giving. If you go with a 5-to-1 match, you're going to get a lot more money coming into the political system no matter what, and you're going to raise more, and they'll get to this point where they're already, both candidates have enough money to run their campaign, and then you're going to be done. So if you have an adequate matching system, which is what the old presidential primary system was. It was an adequate matching system until George Bush's 2000 presidential primary. That's when that started to fall apart. You had an adequate matching primary system. So if you had an adequate primary matching system, take
obviously I'm invested in the matching component of it. I think that there is a pretty significant, and maybe it's only psychological bar, but there's something that is holding the grassroots donor back from making the contribution. And it's not just the absence of being able to multiply the power of that donation through a match. I think that, most people are not used to giving, and when they think about other things that they could give to, they're not going to choose a political donation in competition with those things. It's the combination, and I think there's been some experiences in a couple of states. It's the combination of the tax credit opportunity with a match that creates a kind of synergy, and because then candidates have an incentive, because the match opportunity is so attractive to them, to really go out and work this thing. And I've had a little experience with it because I decided in this last cycle to kind of experiment my own campaign with it. So I decided not to take any PAC donations at all. I've been PAC free for like 23 months. And I went to traditional higher donors and asked them to create a challenge fund for me, sort of modeled after, in the absence of a public fund, raised it privately, but put it off limits. I mean, literally created a separate account in my campaign with instructions to my treasurer that I couldn't touch the money in that account until I had recruited 1,000 grassroots donors, which then put me in the uncommon position of getting up every morning as a congressional candidate thinking about how I could find the $5 donor, the $10 donor, instead of the $1,000 donor. And in fact, when we were close to getting to the 1,000 grassroots, which we did on June 30th, if you'd put a $1,000 donor in front of me and a $5 donor in front of me, the one I'd be paying all the attention to would be the $5 donor. So it completely changed my orientation. But it was not easy. And in that, because, I'm not running for president, you don't have this kind of viral tipping point and all the rest of it. It's rank and file out there slugging, trying to get the grassroots donor. And I felt in that process, if I'd been able to stand up at a house party and say, hey folks, there's this tax credit opportunity for you, that would have helped to generate a faster return in terms of these donations than without it. Now that's again just the...
There are some other technical issues that need to be straightened out too. Like, it was only a month ago that it became unambiguously acceptable to tweet a donation.
Right.
Right. FEC
to cell phone.
had to clarify that. So-
Text.
Because there was a
Text.
text,
Text.
there was a time period you had to have it hit.
But there's still this issue of like all the new technology is ambiguous. It's not clear whether you can use it, whether it's legal, how it's going to be disclosed, and so forth. And so there's a whole bunch of issues.
And we're
out there.
grappling with all of those issues, but only because, I mean, we meaning my campaign, but only because we put ourselves in this position of learning about how you do this, which most of my colleagues don't ever put themselves in that position, so they wouldn't be exploring it. So just on that question of texted donations, there's very high commissions off the groups that the intermediaries that are doing that, and some of the compliance information that should go, there's questions about how. Now, I don't know how Romney and Obama designed their systems to meet all that, but again, I don't have 100 techies in Chicago that can do that, so I've got to look for off-the-shelf solutions. So we're being careful about that, but at least we're focusing on it because we're trying to reach the grassroots now.
Yeah, now, it's also important to make clear what he's talking about here is a tax credit, not a tax deduction. So the point is not that it's available just to the people who are deducting, it's available as a refundable credit to anybody. But the other part which I have a particular interest in, is he's also talking about creating a coupon component, which is at least is an experiment, which would basically be giving people tangible things that they can go out and like tear off and give to their candidate, which would, I think, have the potential to radically increase the percentage of people that are participating. So we might get not just what New York gets, but maybe 2 times what New York gets in people who are participating because of this, New York City gets because of this way of funding. But I agree with you. The fundamental question has got to be how do you increase the number of people who are engaged, and whatever mechanism does that, I think is a technical question you've got to answer. All right, so we have time for some questions. Let me start taking a cue. When you see that I recognize you, you can put your hand down. Got one right here. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So just let us know who you are before you ask your question.
Yeah, Jay Livingston. The super PACs aren't the only organizations that corrupt the electoral process. The 501c4 program in the tax code actually is supposed to be for quote-unquote social welfare organizations, but these organizations can do political lobbying, and they often do very much political lobbying. They can collect unlimited amounts of so-called dark money from individual donors. That program, for instance, was used to send 80 congressmen to Israel last year by AIPAC. So if we're going to have true campaign finance reform, we have to re-examine the 501c4 program as well, don't we?
Well, I think we absolutely need to do that, and ironically, a lot of attention is placed on the super PACs, but super PACs have to disclose their donors, whereas the 501c4s do not. So you get this Russian doll phenomenon where, American Crossroads, GPS, I think, they're the super PAC, right? GPS is super PAC? The other way around? American Crossroads is a super PAC. Crossroads GPS is the 501c4. So Crossroads GPS collects money from donors whose identity is hidden, right? They donate to American Crossroads, and they put down Crossroads GPS as our donor, but you don't know who's behind that group. So disclosure could help there. But we also think that, and in fact our bill has a component that would seek to raise some funds to help defray the cost of the Grassroots Democracy Act, where we look at these social welfare organizations and we say, well, if you're expending more than $500,000 on political activity, then the amounts above that we're going to put some kind of tax on, which we think would create some penalty for those C4s that are really political operations masquerading as social welfare organizations while protecting most of the legitimate ones, because they would probably fall below that in terms of their political expenditure. And there's been attempts, and Mitch McConnell has worked overtime to try to push back on these, to encourage the IRS to push harder on these groups so that we get the kind of real-time disclosure and transparency that ought to be there.
You know, you have not had a chance
Yeah.
to say much. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, generous.
Please, please.
You know, yesterday and today also you mentioned that how this is going to be a little bit of a lift and a sell to the American taxpayer who's being asked in some way or other to pay a little bit more to finance both of the funds, the Grassroots Candidate Fund and the People's Fund. And so I thought just occurred to me about how to put something in here that might make it attractive to the fiscal conservative, right? And so the legislation is designed with asymmetry in mind. I think, you know, the implicit thing is, look, in the good case, there's going to be at least one grassroots candidate, but probably the other person won't be, and that's why the legislation is important. But then, in the ideal, the end game is that in particular districts, both candidates are grassroots candidates. And there, for that end game, maybe you want to put something in for the fiscal conservative to ramp it down a little bit, right? To say that these matches both go down because the asymmetry problem is less than it was, and now we can save the American taxpayer some money because we've gotten to this place. And the tax burden, what I am paying for as a taxpayer, is this situation right now where there's too much money of the bad kind. But if we can get to this place where we're closer to the democratic ideal, then the burden on these funds goes down, the burden on the taxpayer goes down, right? So it's an appeal to the fiscal conservative, and it looks forward to the kind of political system that we want, which is one in which everybody is a grassroots candidate, in which there's a lot less of the special interest and money in there in the first place.
I think that's a good suggestion. It goes a little bit to the adequacy discussion, and we do anticipate that over time you begin to see fundamental shifts and changes in the way money is coming into politics as people make judgments about return on their investment and so forth. And so I think that's a very fair point.
Yeah, Congressman, sorry I missed the talk last night. I don't know if you addressed the issue of bundling. Every time you move some of the pieces on the board, you have to, obviously what we're doing is trying to think really hard about all the worst case scenarios and unintended consequences that could happen. So could you have a situation where instead of, you doing 50 house parties, instead there's agents just like these paid petitioner gatherer managers who you can work with that bundle just massive amounts of these small dollar contributions, including, management corporations that slyly, subtly pressure employees to all contribute their $50. What do you have to say on that?
It's a fair question, and we're going to have to be alert to making sure we design this in ways that protect against that. We did think a little bit about some of this kind of cottage industry out there, direct mail and other groups that really make a killing on just going out and finding donors and so forth. And you could see them really wanting to get into the act now if there's this incentive to raise a lot of grassroots donations. And I think the question last night was, a lot of those folks use questionable tactics. They play on people's fears and all the rest of it. So isn't this giving them an opportunity to just expand on that? And we have to be careful about it and think of ways to combat it. In our bill, we've said that you can't, if you're going to be a grassroots candidate, that there's got to be a certain limit on the overhead in your campaign that's going to these kinds of activities. And by keeping that number relatively low, we think we could keep some of the more sinister actors out of the mix. But it's a fair question and one we need to look at.
I want to give some disclosure before I respond, which is I was on the President's National Finance Committee, and so I reached out to people. And not only did I do that, I taught a class called Obama University, where I went around and I taught people how to fundraise, right? And I'll tell you, I really look at this like mobilization. I look at it like organizing people. And I think that certainly there's a problem when the only people that we're mobilizing are people who can give a $75,000 check, right? That's the direction that we're going in terms of these C4s and super PACs, because there's this fear that the only way you're going to compete with that outside money is the maximum contribution, and so there's an incentive to focus on those folks, right? Now, in terms of my raising and the raising that I taught, right, it's this notion of a lower dollar, $250, $500. It's sad that that's lower dollar nowadays, right? But how do you teach other people how to raise and bring them in? And then once they've given a contribution, teach them how to raise. And I'll tell you, I think that's great. I think that's democracy, right? And I think the only way we're going to make this thing viable is not some mechanical email blast from a central campaign headquarters that mechanically prompts people to give at specific times when things happen, if a terrorist is killed or something like that, right? But people who develop real relationships with one another, friends who encourage somebody to give and encourage them to come in and not just make a contribution, but be a leader and reach out to their friends. I think that's good. I think that's democracy. So I don't look at so-called bundling as circumventing democracy. My question is, how do we bottle it and ensure that more people can utilize this as a tool? Indeed, I think that's the only way we're going to accumulate the vast sums of money that we need to be able to compete with super PACs.
Stand back here. Just again, your name, please.
My name is Ken Bishop, and question for Congressman Sarbanes. First, I want to say I think it's a noble effort, and I support it, but I'm somewhat pessimistic for a couple of reasons. One is the tax neutrality issue. We have to get this passed through Boehner and Grover Norquist. How are they welcoming this sort of legislation?
No. Let me get no.
And the second thing is, it goes to the advocacy discussion, and even with tax incentives in place, how many people do you really project will participate? And will it be enough to effectively blunt the impact of super PACs and 501c4s, et cetera? Have you done any real-world marketing research to see how many people would want to respond to this sort of change in the law? For me personally, the reason why I don't get involved and why a lot of average people don't really get involved that much is because I know that if I come to Washington, I'm going to have to get in line behind the people from K Street. We don't get access personally with our elected representatives. The lobbyists still run the game. So that's really the problem.
Well, one of the reasons that you feel that way, is, well, it's true. You do have to get behind the line. But that's because under the current system, it's the K Street lobbyists who have basically purchased access, and they're kind of crowding you out of the process. And that's one of the basic premises for this reform, is that if you think there, and we can get back to this a little bit more perhaps, but if you think there is some dependency that's been created, and I think there is, and Larry Lessig thinks there is, and others do as well, on these large money special interest groups out there. And I always put large money in front of special interests because there are special interests that are not large money, and special interests are legitimate. People all have special interests. But the more dependent you are on them for the money to fund your campaign, then the more access they're going to get. Maybe not be conscious on the part of members of Congress, but it happens. And the more favorably probably you'll end up tilting in their direction. Now, it's hard to quantify that. It's hard to prove like a direct causal relationship. And I know this is what Steve has worked with for a long time. That's my perspective from being inside it. And you can't necessarily judge it just by looking at contributions that come in and then the votes that are cast on things that finally make it to the floor, because there's all kinds of opportunities to amend things before they get to the floor, to decide whether they're even going to get out of committee, right? Whether they're even going to be heard in committee. So there's a lot of steps along the way that don't get registered in a way that you could compare them to where the money's coming from. But I do think there's that dependency. And if we can free members of Congress from that, because now they can be dependent on the people, then when you show up in Washington, you may be able to get close to the front of the line because you're the ones that we depend on. So I think that's really part of what's motivating me here is talking to people like yourself, as I do in my own district, who are incredibly frustrated and feel like their voice can't be heard and doesn't matter. In terms of the viability of this proposal going forward, I cannot announce to you today that John Boehner has endorsed this legislation, and I don't expect to be able to announce that tomorrow either. But I do think that there's an opportunity for us to reach out to members of Congress across the political spectrum, because we're all feeling the burden of this, and also to reach out to average people across the political spectrum, because the folks that feel left out occupy, all points along the political spectrum.
From Sacramento, thank you very much for your speech last night. It was a really inspiring act. We've been anticipating your arrival for weeks. I want to ask about the larger campaign. Who are the other 21 co-sponsors, and how would you characterize them? What kind of districts are they from?
Yeah.
What ideas do the 2 of you, or 21 of you have for getting up to 40 co-sponsors?
Well, yeah, we actually introduced it with 31 original co-sponsors. I think we're up to about 38 or 41 co-sponsors now. And the original 31 were quite carefully targeted. We wanted to make sure that all of the people that have been very active in this kind of reform space were part of it, because we didn't want this to be presented as in competition with or trying to subvert or cannibalize other proposals, because as I said a moment ago, I feel very strongly that what's important here is getting the concepts out there, building momentum behind them, that the details, and there's a lot of complexity. I mean, we're just talking about my proposal. There's other proposals out there that come at it a different way. There's a lot of merit to all of them, and figuring out sort of what the final version of all this looks like is going to be a process. But if we can all agree that we want this kind of change to happen, that's what's important. So we looked for co-sponsors who came having been part of other efforts. And I'm, for example, trying to get on as a co-sponsor on all of the bills that are being submitted by others and vice versa, because we want to kind of show that solidarity behind the overall proposal. We also looked for pretty good geographic distribution, which we achieved. And many of the people also are folks that have worked with some of these outside groups that have been real advocates along the way.
I just had one thought based on some work I've done with conservatives. It seems to be a really good conservative appeal to be made out of this in certain kinds of districts where there are lots of frustrated conservative individuals who hate big business, big government, big everything. This could be pitched in a very appealing way.
I think you can frame it, and there's discussions about that happening in ways that have broad appeal and can be viewed as this being really a nonpartisan proposal. I still think a lot of the push is going to come from the Democratic side, just when you look at sort of the tradition of people that have been involved in this. But I think that push can happen without alienating the potential for participation on the other side.
Tom Flaherty. I'm curious. It seems to me, if the FCC monitors money, well, I think if we could put a fair arbiter advocate back in the government that would measure the quality. In other words, the truth. We have all kinds of truth seekers now. If somehow we could put in, whether it be FCC, I'm worried because we're going from cable to airwaves, and we don't have net neutrality in the airwaves, only cable, as I understand it. I see us losing the battle long term, going with the airwaves. If people still have faith in their government. I mean, I still have faith in people. The balance came back. We may have Kennedy retire soon and come back into a more sound world. But if we had a fair advocate in, say, the Federal Elections Commission somewhere that would measure the truthfulness, and in the name of adequacy, people would be able to go to this, whether it be required, like it used to be. So much of your ABC, CBS, NBC time is required to be in truthful form. if we could put something in there that would give us that grounding, then I think both sides feel less need to spend, to listen to this high spending money. And it give, I don't know, I just get the idea what.
Well, I'll let others talk. I think the idea of an independent arbiter is a noble one, how you would actually make something like that happen. I mean, I know there's newspapers around the country that have brought on staff, sort of people advocates who sort of hold the newspaper to sort of feet to the fire, and whether you could get the same concept within kind of the broadcasting arena is something people ask might do.
You said public financing wasn't around in this last election, right? And I agree with you that it was, used last time, and that the Obama campaign opted out because, it's a flawed system here. You can't give $50 after a certain date, after the primary's over. But kind of the biggest public financing story of this election cycle was the fact that the candidates were able to use the lowest unit rate in terms of, the FCC monitors the lowest unit rate, so not the FEC, but the FCC in terms of the lowest unit rate, and as a result, they could get lower TV time compared to the super PACs. Super PACs have to pay a lot more for TV time. Now, I'm not saying that's the solution to our problems. I'm just saying that is something that we haven't examined or addressed or discussed, but it is a factor in terms of Obama being able to have more TV time and spend less money than the others.
Can I make just a quick comment? There's another part of my bill that tries to close a loophole that the broadcasting industry has been using to get around some of the requirements of the lowest unit cost requirement. So, for example, what they do to a lot of congressional candidates is they say, well, we'll give you the lowest cost, and we're going to benchmark some period outside of the campaign, and then they choose like Super Bowl Sunday as the benchmark. Or they'll say, well, we'll give you the lowest unit cost, but gee, we're going to run your commercial at 4 a.m. in the morning, that kind of thing. So we actually thought about, when it came to the airwaves, whether we should, pursue trying to get free time or discounted time and so forth. We decided maybe not worth the battle that would ensue, but let's at least ask the broadcasting industry to step up and meet fairly the requirements they've already said that they would meet. So we're trying to tighten that up a little bit. So if you look at the end of the proposal, you'll see some of that addressed in there.
I'm Reg McKean, and I'd like to know how many of the 41 co-sponsors are members of the Republican Party. I would also like to know if there's any, what sentiment there is in the Senate for a similar bill, and if you have any Republican senators.
There are no Republican co-sponsors right now in the House.
Zero.
That's partly because when we introduced it, which was about 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago, we figured that the exercise of trying to get Republicans on board when we were 6 weeks from Election Day was not worth the investment of time compared with what we think the result will be if we now pursue Republican co-sponsorship going forward. I think as we come away from...
the next Congress?
Yeah, the next Congress, and between that, well, potentially, we're strategizing on this right now, but certainly when we reintroduce this in January, we're going to be going into it with the expectation of building bipartisan co-sponsorship. In terms of the Senate, you have people on the Senate side, Sheldon Whitehouse, Dick Durbin, others who've been very interested in these issues. I think Senator Durbin had a hearing that you presented at, Larry, and so we think Elizabeth Warren is obviously a potential person who could be interested, knows a lot about grassroots funding of campaigns and so forth. So we're going to reach out there, and whether there's potential for Republican co-sponsorship there. I know less about that. That's not the chamber that I play in, but I think there's real opportunity to broaden the appeal here.
Okay, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, and especially Congressman Sarbanes, for this, and thank you for coming and joining us in the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. Yeah, this is great. The whirlwind.
Yeah, thank you very much.